If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever kept quiet in a house where no one truly saw you, then this story is for you. Because this isn't just about a wife everyone looked down on. It's the only story where a woman with no memory brings down an entire family that deceived her because of one old photo hidden in an attic. It all began in Charleston, South Carolina, where charm and Southern grace masked a 3-year-old secret. This is a journey of reclaiming identity, justice, and dignity. And the way she fought back, no one saw it coming. I woke up in a stark white room, the fluorescent lights harsh above me, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air like a reminder I was still alive, but I had no idea why. A nurse smiled and told me my name was Emily Grace Whitmore. I had been in an accident and my husband Julian had brought me home. They said I was lucky, that I had been taken in by a kind family, but strangely, no one asked if I actually wanted to return to that place. The house sat on the edge of Charleston, old, dignified, soaked in Southern charm. The iron gate was always locked, the windows never opened, and every painting on the wall looked at me as if I didn't belong there. Julian, my husband, was handsome, poised, and utterly unfamiliar. He sat in a wheelchair, barely spoke to me, and carried an expression as if he was guarding a secret larger than the house itself. My mother-in-law Dorothy often said, "If it weren't for our family, you'd be dead." And I believed her. I believed everything, because I remembered nothing. But then one night my fingers unconsciously drifted across the keys of an old piano in the study, and each note emerged like muscle memory, as if my hands remembered something my mind had long forgotten. I lived in that house like a piece of furniture, silent, unacknowledged, only mentioned when someone needed something. Julian, my husband, was practically a ghost in my life, even though we shared the same roof. He kept his office door shut at all times, and when we did cross paths, his gaze wasn't that of a husband. It was the gaze of someone studying a lab experiment. I learned to read the atmosphere. When my mother-in-law Dorothy placed her silverware down a little too hard, I knew she was angry. When the maid changed the flowers earlier than usual, it meant important guests were coming, though I was never introduced. Then there was Samantha, Julian's perfect cousin, the only one who came and went from his office like it belonged to her. She had a way of speaking softly, but every word cut deep. "You're lucky, Emily. Julian's always been the type to take responsibility even when not everyone deserves it." I didn't respond. Not because I was afraid, but because I truly didn't know. Maybe I wasn't someone who deserved anything. I had no memory of what I had done or been that made me worth loving. But then one cold, rainy night while searching for a sewing kit in the attic, I opened the wrong trunk. Inside, I found a faded photograph. Me smiling brightly next to a powerful-looking man in a black suit. The handwritten caption below it made my blood run cold: Emily Cross and Benjamin Cross. Charleston Boat Gala, 3 years ago. My hands trembled as I held the photograph. My face in the picture was radiant, beaming with life, yet the eyes, they didn't look like the woman I saw in the mirror every morning. Benjamin Cross. That name fell into my mind like a shard of glass breaking the still surface of forgotten memories. I quietly searched for it online, my fingers tapping the keys like they were reaching for my own heartbeat. Benjamin Cross, chairman of Cross Maritime, the largest shipping empire on the East Coast. Powerful. Respected. And according to every article, he had only one daughter, Emily Cross. Then I saw the line that stole the air from my lungs: Emily Cross presumed dead after a boating accident 3 years ago. Officially declared deceased. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the screen, while a voice whispered faintly in the back of my mind, "That's you." I looked again at the photograph. There was no doubt. I am Emily Cross. And I'm not dead. Images flickered back dim and broken of a lakeside mansion, a long hallway of black and white portraits, and a man who once called me my little girl. I returned to the Whitmore house changed, and I noticed something had shifted. Not in the walls, not in the decor, but in the way they looked at me. Julian no longer seemed indifferent. He looked at me longer, his eyes no longer blank but guarded. Samantha came around less, and when she did, her gaze swept over me like she was trying to measure how much I'd remembered. So I tested them. I left the photo under my pillow. By morning it was gone. I played a classical melody on the grand piano and saw the office door creak open, then quickly close again. They were afraid. And if they were afraid, then I was right. I couldn't wait any longer. I went to a small legal office in the city and asked directly, "Do you still have records for Emily Cross? The woman declared dead 3 years ago." The clerk froze, staring at me. You're her?" I didn't answer. I just met his eyes. He slowly nodded, pulled up the file, and read death certificate submitted. Signed by Julian Whitmore. I walked out of that office with icy hands but a mind burning with fury. The man I called husband hadn't rescued me. He hadn't taken me in out of pity. He had erased me from the world to claim something far bigger than love. I couldn't return to that house the way I did before. Not after what I had just discovered. Every tile, every stair now seemed to breathe whispers I had never heard before, of lies' concealment, and a secret buried deep within my own life. I contacted the legal office again. My voice was hoarse like wind scraping through leaves. I need a full copy of the death certificate. For myself. A few hours later, I held the document in my hands, a thin folder, yet it weighed like a sentence. It read, "Name of the deceased Emily Cross filed by Julian Whitmore, legal husband, cause of declaration lost at sea, body unrecovered. Death declared temporarily for asset resolution." I could barely breathe. I needed someone completely outside the Whitmore world, someone who knew me before my memory was erased. The name came to me like a lightning bolt in the dark. Cliff Bennett. I didn't remember who he was, but somehow my hand had scribbled his name into an old phone book I'd once hidden in a drawer. I found him in a tiny office tucked away in the city's old quarter, one of those places no one visits except those desperate for the truth. When I stepped in, Cliff froze like a statue. "Emily, my God, you're alive?" I nodded. "But I don't remember anything. Can you help me?" He didn't ask much. Just opened the file I handed him. His expression shifted from shock to anger to a steel-cold stare. "They said you were dead. I was hired by Benjamin Cross to investigate your disappearance, but when I started to suspect Julian, you vanished, and all my case files were seized. We did a fingerprint match. He collected a DNA sample, sent it out. 3 days later, the results came back 100% match. Emily Grace Cross. There was no more doubt. I was the rightful heir, erased from my own life by the signature of a caring husband. Cliff helped me compile the evidence, the forged death certificate, DNA results, old photos. We didn't confront anyone directly. I sent the file to the Cross Maritime Board anonymously. I didn't want them to see a trembling woman. I wanted them to see a rightful heir returning. Then the reply came, "Ms. Emily Cross, your identity has been verified. Cross Maritime is prepared to reinstate your estate rights and offer legal assistance as needed." I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there like a statue finally carved with its rightful name. I thought I had won. That night, when I returned to the Whitmore estate, a plain envelope lay at the base of the iron gate. No stamp, no sender. I opened it. Just one line typed neatly. "If you think a DNA test is all it takes, then you're still as naive as before." My palms turned cold. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I couldn't sleep that night. The anonymous letter was like a tiny thorn, seemingly harmless, yet it made my heart bleed. I thought I had escaped, that I had reclaimed my identity touched the truth. But those words, cold and deliberate, told me I had only reached the edge of a far more complex maze. The next morning, I called Cliff. He picked up after 5 rings, his voice oddly weary. "Did you get anything?" I answered softly. A warning. Silence. Then he whispered, "Then they know. You're starting to remember." I asked again, "Who are they?" He didn't answer right away. He just said, "You need to see something." We met at a cafe just outside town. Cliff placed a stack of photos in front of me, photos of Julian, sitting with an older man, silver-haired, composed, his eyes hauntingly familiar. I recognized him, not from memory, but from the mirror. Because those eyes were mine. "That's your father," Cliff said quietly. "Benjamin Cross." I could barely believe it. My father had met with Julian, not once, many times. The photos were taken 2 years ago at a discreet resort in Florida. No one knows about these meetings, Cliff added. No press, no official records, but they happened. Then Cliff looked at me, his eyes hesitant, unsure. "Emily, are you absolutely certain your father had nothing to do with your disappearance?" That question hit like a slap to the fragile trust I was still trying to hold on to. I had believed I was merely the victim of a deceitful husband and his family, but now, everything collapsed again. If the man who gave me life was part of this game, then who could I trust anymore? I left the cafe without saying goodbye. Cliff watched me with concern, but I didn't look back. I didn't need more advice. I didn't need another person to show me the way. What I needed was for no one to know what I would do next. My entire life I had lived on borrowed faith. Faith that my father loved me. Faith that my husband saved me. Faith that silence would keep the peace. But now I knew the truth. Every person I had trusted had a reason to want me gone. I returned to the Whitmore estate as if nothing had changed. Still walked the long hallway. Still paused in front of the wedding portrait that felt like a lie. Still gave Dorothy a polite nod as she looked at me like a guest overstaying her welcome. But something inside me had shifted. And they sensed it. Julian began watching me more closely. Every footstep I took on the old wood floor seemed to trigger a silent alarm. I gave him a blank stare in return, just vacant enough to keep him guessing, just sharp enough to make him uneasy. And then I started my counterattack in silence. I hid voice recorders in flower vases facing his study, installed a micro camera beneath the dining table right where Dorothy and Samantha liked to whisper after dinner. I picked the lock on Julian's old drawer and found a folder full of unsigned power of attorney documents, ready for me to authorize the moment I regained my memory. I made copies of everything. Didn't say a word. Just watched. Meanwhile, I contacted the Cross Maritime Legal Counsel requesting a full audit of all transferred shares under my name. I attached scans, the forged death certificate DNA test results, and an audio clip of Julian saying, "If she remembers, we move the money to the secondary account, then deal with it." Dinner at the Whitmore estate grew quieter after that. A week later, I went to Charleston City Hall, not as a grieving daughter, not as a forgotten wife. I arrived alone wearing a charcoal blazer and handed over a business card that read, "Emily G. Cross, majority stakeholder, 51% ownership." The man who greeted me was Mr. Howard, a municipal investment board member and minor shareholder at Cross Maritime. He glanced at the card, then looked up at me without surprise. "We thought you'd never come back." I lifted my chin. I wasn't gone. I was waiting. And in that moment, I knew something with absolute clarity. I was no longer the one being deceived. I was the one holding the final move. That evening, the Whitmore estate hosted a small party under the guise of celebrating Julian's recovery. I was invited as the guest of honor, the silent, gentle wife who always stayed in the background. I wore a simple black dress and carried a white envelope. No one paid attention. They never had, and that was the last advantage I still possessed. When the toasts were raised, when music began to drown out the small talk, I stepped forward and spoke calmly. If I may, I'd like to say a few words about why I'm really here. Silence fell across the room like someone had pulled the plug on the sound system. I laid the folder on the glass coffee table, then opened it page by page. The death certificate, the DNA confirmation, a printed email from Julian to his private attorney titled, "She Won't Remember." 3 years ago, Emily Cross, was declared dead. My legal husband was the one who signed the papers. But I'm alive, and I've returned. Julian gripped the armrest, face pale. Dorothy dropped her glass. Samantha vanished into the hallway like a ghost. I once believed I was simply betrayed by my husband's family, I continued. But today, I know. The betrayal runs far deeper. I pulled out the photographs Julian and my father, Benjamin Cross, meeting in secret. Proof that not one but both sides, husband and father, knew I was alive. No one spoke when I disappeared. No one searched. Because they needed me. Silent. I looked at Julian, then turned toward the small camera I had hidden earlier, streaming live to Cross Maritime's board of directors who were waiting for confirmation. From me. Today, I choose not to be silent anymore. Not for revenge, but to reclaim my name, my life, and my justice. No one clapped. No one dared to speak. The silence in that room was no longer confusion. It was shame. And for the first time, I wasn't the only one standing outside the circle. After that night, no one dared to call me the poor wife ever again. A few days later, Julian was urgently summoned to district court on charges of identity fraud and forgery. Samantha disappeared from Charleston, leaving behind debts tucked neatly beneath her perfect facade. Dorothy, the same woman who once told me I should be grateful for being taken in, called me, just once, not to apologize, but to beg me to drop the charges. I didn't answer, because sometimes silence is the final answer. I returned to Cross Maritime headquarters, not as a ghost, but as the rightful heir. There were no more suspicious stares, no more whispered questions. Only silence as I walked through the main hall, the kind of silence that comes with acknowledgement. I didn't choose to take on a leadership role. Instead, I delegated full operations to the existing board under one condition: the Emily Cross Foundation, a fund dedicated to supporting women who have lost their rights, identities, or assets due to the betrayal of those closest to them. I used my story to build a corridor of safety for others who had once been locked in silence like I was. The day I signed the documents to reinstate my estate, the lawyer looked up at me and asked, "Would you like to add anything else?" I shook my head. I didn't want compensation. I didn't need a press conference. All I wanted back was the one thing they stole without anyone noticing: my voice. I walked out of that building with a strange feeling, not triumph, but return. I didn't become the strongest woman alive, but I became strong enough to no longer fear the truth. And sometimes, as I learned after 3 years of being gone, it's the forgotten ones who end up preserving the last shred of honor for an entire family. If you've made it this far, maybe you too have been silent when you should have spoken. Maybe you've trusted the wrong people. Or maybe you've simply forgotten how to trust yourself. For years, I believed silence was survival, that if I didn't stir the waters, no one would throw me overboard again. But silence didn't save me. It only made it easier for others to rewrite my story without me in it. I used to think I needed someone to rescue me. Now I know what I needed was to remember who I was before they told me who to be. Justice didn't come in the form of revenge. It came the moment I walked into that boardroom, not to accuse, but to exist fully, truthfully, and on my own terms. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt erased, forgotten, or replaced, Know this. The truth has a way of resurfacing, and even the softest voice, when spoken at the right moment, can bring down a house of lies. You don't have to scream. You just have to stop whispering.